It is the night of the 26th of December, 1830. The day after Christmas. Across the Isle of Thanet, fields lie bare and frosted under the cold Kent sky. In the village of Acol is a hamlet that barely appears on the map. A woman named Elizabeth waits for her husband to come home, but he never does, at least not for a very long time. On that night, the men of West Thanet have done something that cannot be undone. Welcome to Peace Unplugged. This is the podcast that brings you holistic health and includes the exploration of hidden history around Thanet. This episode is exploring a dramatic and little-known piece of history. This is the story of the Swing Riots and of a farmhouse called Hengrove. It's a story of men pushed beyond their endurance, and it's what's happened to them when the law decided to make an example of them. To understand what happened in November and December 1830, we have to understand the world that men lived in at that time on the Isle of Thanet, and of course Birchington, known as Birchington-on-Sea. It's the village where I live, on the northern tip of the Isle of Thanet. It comes from the Old English, Bursen Tun. It's a farmstead near where some birch trees grew. The very roots of Birchington are, in fact, agricultural, so the history is mainly a farming community. Workers rose before dawn, walked out into the fields, and they threshed grain even through all the cold winters until they returned to their cramped cottages, to where they barely had enough to eat. For generations that was hard, but it was apparently bearable. But then came around 50 years' worth of catastrophe. Between 1770 and 1830, around 6 billion acres of common land in England became enclosed by an Act of Parliament. This was land that labourers had used for centuries to graze field animals, to grow veg, and to supplement their wages. But it all got swept away and handed to the landowners, so the rural poor were left with nothing but their labour to sell. This was then interrupted by the Napoleonic Wars. That meant men were needed at the front, so labour then became scarce, and the wages stayed just high enough to survive. But when peace came in 1815, tens of thousands of men were demobilised, and of course they then returned to the labour market. This resulted in corn prices crashing, followed also by wages crashing. By 1829, there was a catastrophically poor harvest. This resulted in farm labourers effectively starving. In Parliament, Lord Carnarvon, he declared that the English labourer had been reduced to a plight more abject than any race in Europe. Added to that, there also was the invention of the threshing machine. Threshing separates grain from its stalks, and for centuries this had been done manually and was a good source of winter employment for agricultural labourers and workers right across the arable lands of Kent. It was slow, labour-intensive, but that physical work kept many men employed, particularly through the cold winter months. A threshing machine, powered by horse or by water, could do the work of many men in a fraction of the time. For the farmer, that meant efficiency and, of course, profit. Unfortunately for the labourers, that meant the end of winter wages, and it left families on the edge of starvation. By 1830, these machines were spreading across Kent, and frankly, the labourers' patience had run out. Here now we reach the story of a mythical figurehead. In August 1830, threshing machines began to be destroyed across all of east of Kent. The first of these was destroyed in the Elan Valley. That was on the night of Saturday. By the third week of October, hundreds of these machines had been destroyed over the county. This movement had a name and a face of sorts. Threatening letters started to arrive at farmhouses right across the country. One of these read, "Sir, your name is down amongst the black hearts in the black book. If you don't change and act quite different to what you have done, you shall have such a fire as you never seen in your life." These letters were signed Captain Swing. It was a fictitious figurehead, but a symbol of the fury felt by A symbol with swing is reference to the swinging stick or the threshing flail. That's the hand tool that these workers used, which was being made obsolete by these new machines. Captain Swing, in fact, never existed, but his name spread terror. That terror seeped through all the farmhouses and the country houses. Some farmers, upon receiving these threatening letters, destroyed their own machines in fear of being attacked by any rioters. At first, Thanet remained calm. Threats were made to farms near Margate. This was in the early October, but actually nothing came of them. Then, in the third week of November 1830, the Isle of Thanet finally caught fire. This was the night of the Powell Arms pub in Birchington, 1st of November 1830. At 10:30, a group of men gathered in this popular inn, Powell Arms. Reports suggested that they had already been drinking in other establishments that evening. Moving from inn to inn across the west of the island, their voices grew louder. Historical documents revealed their names. They've been recorded in court documents, and these documents would later seal their fate. So we have Thomas Hepburn, aged 30, a ploughman and a wheelwright, and he was from Acol. There was William Reed, Thomas Overy, Richard Oliphant, Stephen Bushell, and his brother James Bushell, William Hughes, William Brown, Thomas Golder, and William Lilly. Some of those surnames I know still exist today locally in Birchington, or certainly in the areas around Birchington. These were local men. They were aged between 17 and 33. There were threshers, waggoners, a shoemaker, a brickmaker, a butcher, all working men in Thanet, men with families, with children, and of course they all had debts. Here's the question. Did Thomas Hepburn set out to meet those men on that night? Or was it just a chance encounter? Was this all planned in advance? Or did he just get caught up in the wild talk amongst drinking alcohol? Late that night, those men left the Powell Arms. They moved out into the dark of the countryside. What followed was the beginning of a chain of events that would send them to the other side of the world. By the 26th of November, the Kentish Gazette reported that the Isle of Thanet was a scene of confusion, agitation and alarm from this nightly appearance of gangs of men with their faces whitened by the use of chalk. This was done deliberately, smeared across their faces to disguise their identity. That kind of reminds me of Tolkien and the Lord of the Rings and Saruman's fighting Uruk-hai. Those men that night were armed with bludgeons and axes. They had swords and they had hammers. Some were even rumoured to have been dressed in female clothes. This happened across the west of Thanet. It included Birchington, small hamlet of Acol. Those men moved from farm to farm. Their target was to destroy these newfangled threshing machines. There was one farm that was at the heart of this storm. That's Hengrove Farm. It still exists today. It's a working agricultural holding on the Isle of Thanet, and this farm was squarely in the path of those rioters on that night. Hengrove Farm sits in the flat, fertile countryside, just off the Shottendane Road. That's between the village of Garlinge and what was then known as the hamlet of Manston. That's just a few miles east of Birchington itself. Like so many Thanet farms, it sat on rich, chalky ground, which had been farmed for many centuries, producing those arable crops that fed the towns of Margate, Ramsgate, and of course the city of Canterbury. Hengrove was a working farm in every sense, and threshing was at the very heart of its winter operations. It was here that, according to the Birchington Heritage Trust and their archive of local history, that a group of men and women from the west side of Thanet, including the residents of Birchington and Acol, came in the last days of November 1830 to damage these newfangled machines. The threshing machine at Hengrove Farm was their target. Armed with the tools of their trade, they turned against that technology. It's technology that, of course, was threatening their very livelihood. Birchington unrest was not confined just to Hengrove Farm, or just to men. In November 1830, a 19-year-old woman named she was apparently set fire to thatched outbuildings at a Birchington workhouse, that symbol of hatred at the time. Her intention was to burn the whole place to the ground. Elizabeth had been baptised in Thanet in April 1811. She was arrested, tried at Maidstone, and transported abroad on the ship Mary III that sailed in June 1831, and it arrived in what was then known as Van Diemen's Land. That's the place we now call Tasmania. She was 19 years old, and she never saw England again. The government's response to the Swing Riots was savage. 19 men were hanged. More than 500 were transported. 600. So on Christmas Eve, 1830, just days after the Thanet disturbances, William Packham, aged 20, and Henry Packham, aged 18, were hanged at Pennenden Heath, near Maidstone, for arson on a barn. They had asked for mercy, but Mr. Justice Bosanquet refused. Their crime, he told them, was the deepest enormity. They were to expect no mercy in this world. For the men and women of Birchington and Acol, sentence was passed on the day after Christmas Day, 1830, and they were convicted and sentenced to transportation to Van Diemen's Land. They paid a heavy price for their protest. They had broken a machine, and they lost everything. To the people of Birchington in 1830, Van Diemen's Land was barely comprehensible. I mean, of course, it lay 12,000 miles away. That was the very tip of the known world at the time. It's become a byword for horror stories in England, and this was because of the severity in those convict settlements. The island had been named after the Dutch explorer Abel Tasman in 1642, after his sponsor Anthony van Diemen, Governor-General of the Dutch East Indies. The British settled there in 1803, and they turned it into what would become a penal colony for the entire British Empire. Between 1804 and 1853, more than 73,000 convicts were transported to Van Diemen's Land. Its penal settlements, including the notorious Macquarie Harbour and Port Arthur, they were regarded as the most forbidding places on earth. They were isolated, apparently escape-proof, and they were designed deliberately to break the human spirit. In 1856, the island was finally granted self-governing, and that colonial name changed to what is now known as Tasmania. And that was a deliberate act of rebranding. It was to cut the island from its association with the convict horror. That old name had done its job well. For Thomas Hepburn of Acol, that 33-year-old ploughman, and Will Wright, who'd spent the night on the 21st of November at the Powell Arms in Birchington. The journey to Van Diemen's Land began at Portsmouth Harbour. Ship sailed on the 6th of February, 1831, and that voyage took nearly 4 months. There was notorious conditions on board. Men were shackled below the decks. Diseases spread easily. There was the constant threat of death. However, remarkably, all those convicts survived the journey. The ship arrived in Van Diemen's Land on the 23rd of May, 1831. Those convicts were then allocated to work for free for the settlers, or they were assigned to public works. Thomas Hepburn was assigned to a man, Edward Abbott, the civil commandant at Port Dalrymple, near what is now known as the city of Launceston, in northern Tasmania. Abbott was a former military officer and deputy judge advocate, and he'd been granted 3,000 acres. So Thomas, the ploughman from Acol, found himself working farmland, yes again, but this time on the other side of the world, and also as a convict, rather than as a free man. Meanwhile, back in Acol, his wife Elizabeth, she was now receiving relief for herself and their 2 children. The wife of a transported man in 1830 was effectively like a widow, despite her husband still being alive. In time, transport convicts that behaved were then eligible to apply for their families to join them. Elizabeth Hepburn and her 2 children eventually joined Thomas Hepburn in Van Diemen's Land. Over time, the Hepburns had 3 more children. That's a family of 7, built on the other side of the world, and they were rooted in soil, just as Thomas had been in the fields of Acol and the farming community around Birchington. Whether Thomas Hepburn died as a free man in Tasmania, or whether he carried the shadow of the conviction all his life, the records do not reveal to us. But the descendants of the family, if they exist today, well, they may carry the blood of West Thanet in the land their ancestor never chose to go and live, and that he could barely have imagined. In the immediate aftermath of the Swing Riots, very little changed for the agricultural labourer. The threshing machines were effectively rebuilt. Their wages didn't rise. Poor laws tightened further. The hated Poor Law of 1834 would strip relief from the able-bodied poor and confine the desperate to the workhouse. But those riots were not without consequence. They demonstrated to Parliament and those in power just how close the south of England came to some kind of revolution. They contributed towards pressure that produced the Great Reform Act of 1832. They showed, in the starkest possible terms, the costs of treating an entire class of workers as expendable. And in Birchington, in the years that followed, the community made its own attempts at justice. The overseers of the poor, working with public-spirited villagers, began buying grain at market price and selling it more cheaply to the labourers. A small local tax was levied to those better-off residents, including local farmers. It was modest, but it was at least something. The Swing Riots of 1830 are remembered, if at all, as a national event, a chapter in the history of English labour, of the agricultural revolution, and of class conflict. The point is, they happened here, in the very fields of the Isle of Thanet, on farms like Hengrove, significantly in a pub called the Powell Arms in Birchington. This happened among men named Thomas, William, Richard, Stephen, James, men whose names are in the court records, whose families stayed behind in Acol and worried, whose lives were split in 2 by a sentence passed the day after Christmas. The fields of Thanet stretch in every direction. Chalk is still under our feet. The memory of that winter night still lies quiet and waiting. You've been listening to the podcast of Peace Unplugged, and it's part of the local history podcasts that I've been delivering, bringing to you some of the hidden histories around the Isle of Thanet. If you want to dig deeper into some of these stories, I recommend that you visit the Birchington Heritage Trust, which currently resides in the Birchington Library. You could try looking up the Thanet Farms Archive, the Kent History and Library Centre in Maidstone. That holds many of the maps and the estate records, and they may tell you more about Hengrove Farm and perhaps of the families caught up in that history. So actually, are you in fact descended from Hepburns, Reed, Overy, Oliphant, Bushell, Hughes, Brown, Golder, Lilly, or Studham families? Do you have a connection with Hengrove Farm or any of the farms west of Thanet? I'd like to hear from you. History like that lives in people. It doesn't have to stay buried. If you've enjoyed this episode, then please subscribe. Please leave me a review. Share it with anybody that you know who may find it of interest. So until next time, when I'll share with you another piece of history that's linked to the Isle of Thanet and Birchington. Bye for now.